Trump's envoy Witkoff meets Putin as ceasefire deadline looms. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Russia's Vladimir Putin have met at the Kremlin as Donald Trump's deadline for Moscow to agree a ceasefire in Ukraine looms. The talks lasted 3 hours, Russian media report, after Witkoff landed in Russia early on Wednesday. The U.S. president has said Russia could face hefty sanctions, or see secondary sanctions imposed against all those who trade with it, if it doesn't take steps to end the horrible war with Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, has warned that Russia would only make serious moves towards peace if it began to run out of money. He welcomed the threat of tougher U.S. sanctions and tariffs on nations buying Russian oil. In images shared by Russian outlets, the two men, who have met several times before, were seen smiling and shaking hands in a gilded hall. Expectations are muted for a settlement by Friday, and Russia has continued its large-scale air attacks on Ukraine despite Trump's threats of sanctions. Before taking office in January, Trump claimed he would be able to end the war between Russia and Ukraine in a day. He failed and has since grown impatient at a lack of tangible progress, with his rhetoric towards Russia hardening. "We thought we had the war settled numerous times, and then President Putin goes out and starts launching rockets into some city like Kyiv, and kills a lot of people in a nursing home or whatever," he said last month. 3 rounds of talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul have failed to bring the war closer to an end, 3.5 years after Moscow launched its full invasion. Moscow's military and political preconditions for peace remain unacceptable to Kyiv and to its Western partners. The Kremlin has also repeatedly turned down Kyiv's requests for a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Meanwhile, the U.S. administration approved $200 million of additional military sales to Ukraine on Tuesday, following a phone call between Zelensky and Trump, in which the two leaders also discussed defense cooperation and drone production. Ukraine has been using drones to hit Russia's refineries and energy facilities, while Moscow has focused its air attacks on Ukraine's cities. The Kyiv City Military Administration said the toll of an attack on the city last week rose to 32 after a man died of his injuries. The strike was the deadliest on Kyiv since the start of the invasion. Ukrainian authorities on Wednesday reported that a Russian attack on a holiday camp in the central region of Zaporizhia left 2 dead and 12 wounded. "There's no military sense in this attack, it's just cruelty to scare people," Zelensky said. Putin and Trump's relationship has soured, but behind the posturing, a Ukraine deal is still possible. Has the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin gone off the rails? A popular Russian newspaper thinks so. It turned to trains to illustrate the current state of U.S.-Russian ties. "A head-on collision seems unavoidable," declared tabloid Moskovsky Komsomolets recently. "The Trump locomotive and the Putin locomotive are speeding towards each other, and neither is about to turn off or stop and reverse. For the Putin locomotive, it's full steam ahead, with the so-called special military operation, Russia's war in Ukraine. The Kremlin leader has shown no desire to end hostilities and declare a long-term ceasefire. Meanwhile, the Trump locomotive has been accelerating efforts to pressure Moscow into ending the fighting, announcing deadlines, ultimatums, threats of additional sanctions against Russia, and hefty tariffs on Russia's trading partners, like India and China. Add to all of that the 2 U.S. nuclear submarines, which President Trump claims he's repositioned closer to Russia. When you switch from talking about locomotives to nuclear subs, you know things are serious. But does that mean the White House is really on a collision course with the Kremlin over Ukraine? Or is a visit to Moscow this week by Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, a sign that for all the posturing, a deal between Russia and America to end the fighting is still possible? A warm start following Trump's return. In the early weeks of the second Trump presidency, Moscow and Washington appeared well on track to reboot their bilateral relations. No hint of a head-on collision. Far from it. At times it seemed as if Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump were in the same carriage, moving in the same direction. In February, the United States sided with Russia at the United Nations, opposing a European-drafted resolution that had condemned Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In a telephone call that month, the two presidents talked about visiting each other's countries. It felt like a Putin-Trump summit could happen any day. Meanwhile, the Trump administration was exerting pressure on Kyiv, not on Moscow, and picking fights with traditional U.S. allies, such as Canada and Denmark. In speeches and TV interviews, American officials were fiercely critical of NATO and of European leaders. All of this was music to the Kremlin's ears. America now has more in common with Russia than Washington does with Brussels or with Kyiv. Political scientist Konstantin Blokhin from the Russian Academy of Sciences Center for Security Studies told the Izvestia newspaper in March. The following month the same newspaper was crowing, "The Trumpists are revolutionaries, they are wreckers of the system, they can only be supported in this. The unity of the West is no more, geopolitically it is no longer an alliance. Trumpism has destroyed the transatlantic consensus confidently and quickly." Meanwhile, Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff had become a regular visitor to Russia. He made 4 trips here in just over 2 months, spending hours in talks with Vladimir Putin. After one meeting, the Kremlin leader presented him with a portrait of Donald Trump to take back to the White House. President Trump was said to be, quote, clearly touched by the gesture. But President Trump was looking for more than just a painting from Moscow. He wanted President Putin to sign up to an unconditional comprehensive ceasefire in Ukraine. Trump's increasing frustration. Confident that Russia holds the initiative now on the battlefield, Vladimir Putin has been reluctant to stop fighting, despite his claim that Moscow is committed to a diplomatic solution. Which is why Donald Trump has grown increasingly frustrated with the Kremlin. In recent weeks he has condemned Russia's relentless attacks on Ukrainian cities as disgusting, disgraceful, and accused President Putin of talking a lot of bullshit on Ukraine. Last month, Donald Trump announced a 50-day ultimatum to President Putin to end the war, threatening sanctions and tariffs. He subsequently reduced that to 10 days. The deadline is due to expire at the end of this week. So far there is no sign that Vladimir Putin will yield to pressure from Washington. Then again, how much pressure does Vladimir Putin really feel under? Because Donald Trump has changed so many deadlines and he's twisted one way or another, I don't think Putin takes him seriously, believes Nina Khrushcheva, a professor of international affairs at the New School, a university in New York City. Putin's going to fight for as long as he can, or unless Ukraine says we're tired, we are willing to accept your conditions. I think Putin sits there in the Kremlin and thinks that he's fulfilling the dreams of the Russian czars, and then the general secretaries such as Joseph Stalin, in showing the West that Russia should not be treated with disrespect. A deal is still possible. From the picture I've painted so far, it may look as if a head-on collision between the Putin and Trump locomotives is inevitable. Not necessarily. Donald Trump sees himself as a great deal-maker, and, from the look of things, he hasn't given up trying to secure one with Vladimir Putin. Steve Witkoff is due back in Russia this week for talks with the Kremlin leader. We don't know what kind of an offer he may bring with him, but some commentators in Moscow predict there will be more carrot than stick. It did not go unnoticed that on Sunday President Trump said Russia seemed to be pretty good at avoiding sanctions. On Monday, Ivan Loshkarev, associate professor of political theory at MGIMO University Moscow, told Izvestia that to facilitate dialogue, Mr. Witkoff may present, quote, advantageous offers of cooperation to Russia that would open up after a deal on Ukraine. Might that be enough to persuade the Kremlin to make peace after 3.5 years of war? There's no guarantee. After all, so far in Ukraine Vladimir Putin hasn't budged from his maximalist demands on territory, Ukraine's neutrality and the future size of the Ukrainian army. Donald Trump wants a deal, Vladimir Putin wants victory.